Early life. It has from earliest times been deemed proper to love and admire the brave. But when in addition to the most reckless bravery there is added a nobility of character and a passionate love of country such as characterized our Nelson, a panegyric even is justified, nay, more deserved. This, therefore, is our justification in the present year when the centenary of his greatest victory is celebrated and his glorious death is mourned, for putting into simple language a record of the life and actions of Britain's greatest sea son. To protect our island home from invasion, armed fleets are requisite, but be those fleets not manned by dauntless-hearted tars, and their direction entrusted to fearless and enlightened captains, their existence is of no effect. As it is the genius of the man who plans the battle which alone leads on to victory, should our present naval supremacy be assailed by the united navies of the continent, as was the case 100 years ago today, it will be woe to us if a second Nelson does not arise to save us from destruction. 100 years ago we stood alone, with the navies of the nations close arrayed to annihilate us, to crush us for good and all, but it was Nelson's genius which proved our savior, and it was he who laid the foundation for that prosperity which we now enjoy. Is it not therefore fitting, as we commemorate the crowning act of his glorious life and mourn his untimely death, that we should look back upon his life and record again and yet again the noble deeds he wrought? For that crowning victory in Trafalgar's Bay it was that rendered Waterloo a possibility, and initiated that succession of events which culminated in the fall of despotism and freed the world for a whole century. Just 100 years ago, the united navies of Europe were leagued against us, and Horatio Nelson, with shattering strokes, broke up that alliance, swept away or captured the hostile armaments, and held our flag aloft to wave above the vessels of this land of liberty. As the Horatius of old dealt his fierce strokes upon the champions as they successively attacked him, so did our Horatio, by his successive victories, annihilate those fleets, overwhelming their last and greatest combination near Trafalgar, making our bridge secure until today. The first Horatius lived to enjoy the honors showered upon him for his noble deeds. The second one, Horatio, was stricken down even as the victory was won, and a nation's tears were all the guerdon our fathers could pour out for him. Nelson's history is woven into the story of two others, and in thinking of that trio, those three little men, for each was small of stature, I think also of the mysterious ways in which divine providence shapes the ways of men. Shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. Little did the world reck when, in the year 1769, two boys were born, one in the village of Ajaccio in Corsica, an island in the blue Mediterranean, and one on Merrion Street, Dublin, that these were eventually to hold the destinies of the world in their hands, that one was to become the scourge of Europe, and the other was to meet and overthrow him and make free the continent. Little, too, did those who saw a weakly, almost sickly youngster rambling about the lanes of Norfolk, or playing in the parsonage grounds at Burnham Thorpe, a lad of 11 years of age. He was born on the 29th September 1758. Imagine they were looking at one who was predestined to be the mighty naval hero, who by his genius would make possible the meeting of the two in after years. Yet so it was. That little boy was Horatio Nelson, son of Edmund and Catherine Nelson, and great-grandson, through his mother, of the sister of the famous Sir Robert Walpole. 2 years before, in 1767, Horatio's mother had died, and he and 6 brothers and sisters were a heavy charge upon the income of the clergyman their father. Perhaps indeed it was that burden of his brothers and sisters keep that weighed heavily upon the parents when the new baby appeared, for it was with the hope that his godfather, the first Lord Walpole, might be induced in after years to favor him with his protection and influence that he received his name Horatio. And as it turned out, the influence of his godfather did come to his assistance on several occasions in his earlier manhood. His uncle, on his mother's side, Maurice Suckling, was captain of HMS Raisonnable when Horatio was 12 years old. And all the lad's thoughts were turned, as are lads' thoughts even today, to the delights and wonders of a seaman's life. He and his brothers had long talks about their future life, and a sea vocation was Horatio's, despite the fact that he was small and weakly, and to all appearance utterly unfitted for the hardships on board ship. One day he persuaded his elder brother to write to his father, who was staying at Bath for a course of medicinal treatment, and his father approached his brother-in-law upon the subject. The hardy sea captain, as he pictured in his memory, his delicate little nephew laughed at the idea. But the nephew, with that dogged determination which distinguished him through life, persisted, and finally Captain Suckling gave permission to send Horatio to him for a year's trial, saying that a year would either cure him of his fancy or kill him off for good and all. Though delicate-looking and small, there was that within the lad which marked out the hero. For he possessed not only a sharpness of action, a plucky determination, but also he was almost devoid of fear. Southey has preserved an anecdote of Nelson in his life of that hero, which, though often told, is well worth repeating. When a mere child, he strayed a bird nesting from his grandmother's house in company with a cowboy. The dinner hour elapsed, he was absent and could not be found, and the alarm of the family became very great, for they apprehended that he might have been carried off by gypsies. At length, after search had been made for him in various directions, he was discovered alone, sitting composedly by the side of a brook, which he could not get over. "I wonder, child," said the old lady, "that hunger and fear did not drive you home." "Fear, grandmother," replied the future hero. "I never saw fear. What is it?" Let me add another story to exemplify one more quality of the lad, his intense sense of honor. Once after the winter holidays, when he and his brother William had set off on horseback to return to school, they came back because there had been a fall of snow, and William, who did not much like the journey, said it was too deep for them to venture on. "If that be the case," said the father, "you certainly shall not go, but make another attempt, and I will leave it to your honor. If the road is dangerous, you may return, but remember, boys, I leave it to your honor." The snow was deep enough to have afforded them a reasonable excuse, but Horatio was not to be prevailed upon to turn back. "We must go on," said he. "Remember, brother, it was left to our honor." Finding Horatio determined to go to sea, his father saw him on the coach for Chatham, and said goodbye, and the youngster began that life which became so famous in the annals of English naval history. He began miserably, for when he left the coach at the stopping place, he failed to find anyone who could direct him to find the raisonnable, and wandered about wet and miserable, a forlorn little fellow, so forlorn indeed that a passing officer looked at him, looked again, and stopped and interrogated him as to who he was and why he was so sad. Horatio told him his name, and also that he was going to join his uncle's ship, the raisonnable, but no one could tell him where she was. This officer was a friend of Captain Suckling, so he took charge of that little fellow, had him home and gave him a good dinner, and afterwards put him into a foy boat, directing the man where to take him. Horatio's troubles did not end here. When he had scrambled on board, no one knew anything about his coming. By some oversight, his uncle had forgotten to mention to the officer in charge that a new young gentleman was expected, and that he was a relation of his own. There was always plenty of work on board a warship in harbor, and the people passed and repassed, taking no notice of the youngster, except perhaps to tell him to get out of the way. So he stood on deck in the falling sleety showers all that evening, all that night, and into the next day, cold, hungry, neglected, miserable, but keeping his heart up. Next day, one of the ship's officers passing the boy wondered who he could be, spoke to him, and taking pity upon him, got him below to the midshipman's den, and ordered some food to be given him. For this Horatio was intensely grateful. Thus it was that Nelson in 1770 first trod the deck of one of His Majesty's ships of war, and became an item on board the raisonnable, beginning the life of a sailor for good or ill. When his uncle arrived on board, he was made more comfortable, but shortly afterwards orders came to pay the vessel off, and Suckling was in difficulties what to do with the lad. At that time, there was a merchant vessel loading for the West Indies, and as one of the petty officers of the raisonnable was among the ship's officers, Captain Suckling suggested to Horatio that loafing about port would do him little good, but that a voyage in a trader might teach him his duties. The boy fell in with his uncle's views, and was entered upon the books for the voyage there and back. The hardships the lad endured during that voyage proved almost too much for him, and he began to find that sea life was not the enjoyable one he had pictured. Over and above this, he found in conversation with the late petty officer of the raisonnable that bad as life was on board a trader, it was 10 times worse on board a man of war, and it was all he could do to stick to his resolution and not go home when he returned to the Medway. Meanwhile, Captain Suckling had been transferred to the Triumph, a 74-gun sail of the line, but with no prospect of being sent on active service. Determined, however, to do all he could to teach his nephew his duties, the uncle put him into the pilot's service. Here he learned the art of pilotage, a knowledge which stood him in good stead in many a fray later on. He was taught the duties of guiding vessels up and down the River Thames, from the Nore to the Tower, and being apt soon became proficient, and young as he was spoken of as a reliable Thames pilot. The Triumph, being still laid up in the Medway in two of His Majesty's bombs, or as we would say today, gunboats, being ordered to proceed on a voyage of discovery into the Arctic Circle, Horatio asked to go with them. His uncle obtained permission, and he set sail for the frozen north. One incident which occurred while in the Arctic regions tells of the lad's pluck and absolute fearlessness, and it may be told here. Horatio and another lad slipped off one foggy day on a voyage of discovery on their own account, and their absence being discovered, a search party was about to be dispatched when the fog lifted, and the lads were seen some distance off attacking a huge bear. Alarmed for their safety, signals were made for their instant return, and Horatio's comrade obeyed. Nelson, whose gun was useless, the pan being empty, refused to obey orders. "Only let me get a blow at the devil with the butt end of my musket, and we will have him," he said. A gap in the ice intervening alone saved the lives of the lads, as the bear could not get at them. Seeing their position, the captain ordered a gun to be fired, the roar of which startled Bruin, and he made off, and Horatio had to return to his vessel to stand a reprimand from his captain. In reply to the question why he had not instantly returned, the young hero replied respectfully, though agitated, "Sir, I wished to kill the bear, that I might carry the skin to my father." After an arduous time in the Arctic regions, the vessels returned home and were paid off. Captain Suckling now arranged for Horatio to be rated upon the books of the Seahorse, Captain Farmer. In her he voyaged to the East Indies, during which voyage he developed such good seaman-like qualities that he was marked for promotion, young as he was. While on this station, Horatio contracted fever, and had to be sent home in the Dolphin to find on his arrival that his uncle had been promoted to Comptroller of the Navy. Captain Suckling's influence got his nephew appointed acting lieutenant of the Worcester, a 64-gun frigate, and on 8th April 1777, young Nelson passed for lieutenant most honorably. A pleasing incident occurred at that examination. The president happened to be Captain Suckling himself, and he said not a word about the candidate being his nephew until, having passed creditably, he introduced Horatio to his examiners, to their great astonishment, telling them at the same time he wanted the youngster to receive no favors, but to prove his mettle unbefriended, as he knew he would do. From the Lowestoft, to which Horatio was appointed second lieutenant, he was, after a voyage to the West Indies, transferred to the Bristol, and became here first lieutenant, being appointed commander of the Badger brig. While in command of her, he prevented what might have proved a calamity by his fearlessness. The Glasgow, 20 guns, lying alongside the Badger in Montego Bay, Jamaica, took fire. The latter's crew rushed to the boats, but Nelson ordered them back, and until they had thrown all gunpowder overboard and pointed all their guns upwards, so as to do no injury, he would not allow one of them to enter the boats. This action saved many lives, as the explosion might have set fire to other vessels, and the bombardment by the 20 cannon must assuredly have killed many. Shortly after taking command of the Badger, Nelson was made post-captain of the Hinchinbrook of 28 guns. This was on 11th June 1779, he being then short of 3 months of attaining 21. Truly a young post-captain. Up till now, Nelson had to thank the influence of his uncle and his other friends, including his godfather, for his rapid rise in his adopted profession. But being post-captain, all the benefits of the service were open to him, and merit could do more for him than the voice of friends. His skill as a sailor was acknowledged, and loud were the praises heard on his behalf. Let us see.